Good morning. I'm Nova Blake, and this is your complete political briefing for Saturday, May 2nd, 2026. Today, thousands take to the streets in May Day protests across America. The Senate blocks the Iran war powers resolution for a sixth time. The United States economy grows 2% in the first quarter, but inflation spikes to its highest level in nearly 3 years. And Maine Governor Janet Mills drops out of the Senate race, clearing the path for a political outsider. Let's get into it. Starting with the top stories from across the American political landscape. Thousands of Americans turned out for May Day demonstrations in cities across the country on Friday, following a call from a broad coalition of labor unions, immigrant rights groups, and anti-war organizations for a boycott of work, school, and shopping in protest of the Trump administration's policies. The National Education Association, the nation's largest labor union with 3 million members, was a key organizer of the events, which were held under the banner May Day Strong. The protests drew participants in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, Boston, and dozens of other cities, with demonstrators calling for a shift in the nation's tax burden from working people to the wealthy, an end to the Iran war, and the elimination of immigration and customs enforcement. A May Day protest was visible from the White House South Lawn as President Trump departed by helicopter on Marine One. The Senate voted 47-50 to block an Iran war powers resolution for a sixth consecutive time Thursday, just hours before the war's 60-day statutory deadline under the war powers resolution arrived on Friday, May 1st. Senate Democrats, led by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, have forced war powers votes every week since the war began in late February, and every attempt has been defeated along nearly party line lines. Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania was again the only Democrat to vote with Republicans. Republican Senators Susan Collins of Maine and Rand Paul of Kentucky were the only Republicans to cross party lines. The administration still has not submitted a formal 30-day extension certification to Congress or transmitted an authorization for use of military force request, leaving the war's legal basis in a state of unresolved constitutional ambiguity. Maine Governor Janet Mills dropped out of the Democratic Senate primary on Thursday, conceding that she could not raise enough money to compete against political newcomer Graham Platner. Mills, a 78-year-old two-term governor who entered the race last October, backed by Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, had been widely considered one of the Democrats' most electable recruits in the entire country for the 2026 midterms. Platner, a 41-year-old oyster farmer and military veteran endorsed by Senators Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Ruben Gallego, and Martin Heinrich, now has a clear path to the Democratic nomination. The June 9th primary race clears just in time for Democrats to unite behind Platner to take on Republican Senator Susan Collins, who is seeking her sixth term in a state where Collins has outlasted national headwinds before and where Trump lost by 7 percentage points in 2024. The United States economy grew at an annualized rate of 2% in the first quarter of 2026, a rebound from the prior quarter's anemic 0.5% growth rate, but slightly below economists' projections of 2.2 to 2.3%. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis released the advance estimate Thursday. The growth was driven by a 10.4% annualized surge in business investment, higher exports, and a bounce back in government spending after the longest shutdown on record in the fourth quarter. However, a closely watched inflation gauge, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCE, rose at a 3.2% annual rate in the first quarter, above the Federal Reserve's 2% target and the highest reading in almost 3 years. The average price of a gallon of gasoline hit $4.30 Thursday, the highest since July 2022, as Brent crude oil topped $126 per barrel. President Trump replaced his pick for United States Surgeon General on Thursday, withdrawing the nomination of Dr. Casey Means, a wellness influencer and functional medicine advocate, and replacing her with Dr. Nicole Saphier, a Fox News medical contributor and radiologist. Mills' nomination had been stalled in the Senate amid questions about her medical credentials and whether she had ever held a state medical license. Her license applications in Oregon and California were withdrawn before being approved, and she has never practiced clinical medicine. Saphier is a board-certified radiologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, who is widely known for her television commentary. Her nomination is seen as significantly more likely to advance through the Senate confirmation process. The Senate passed a resolution on Thursday to ban all members of Congress and their staff from trading on prediction markets, websites and platforms that allow users to bet real money on political outcomes, including election results, legislation passage, and government policy decisions. The measure passed by unanimous consent, with no objections from either party, reflecting bipartisan concern that congressional insiders have access to non-public information that could give them an unfair advantage on predictive betting platforms. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts had questioned Defense Secretary Hegseth at his Thursday hearing about whether certain congressional members were potentially engaging in insider trading by placing prediction market bets tied to the Iran war's progress. The Trump administration is advancing a proposed rule change that could slash or eliminate Supplemental Security Income, known as SSI, benefits for an estimated 400,000 disabled adults, including people with Down syndrome and dementia, who live with family members who receive food assistance through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. The rule, initiated by White House officials and the now-defunct Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, would count a family's receipt of SNAP benefits as in-kind support and maintenance, a designation that reduces SSI monthly payments or eliminates them entirely. Disability rights organizations called the proposed rule an unprecedented attack on the most vulnerable Americans, while advocates noted the change could force caregivers to choose between feeding their families and keeping their disabled relatives housed with them. Speaker Mike Johnson declared Thursday that it is not necessary for Congress to weigh in on the Iran war authorization question because, in his view, the United States is not currently at war. Johnson's comment, made during a press conference, directly contradicts the military's own designation of the conflict as Operation Epic Fury and flies in the face of the confirmed deaths of 13 United States service members in combat operations, the $25 billion expenditure in munitions, and the active naval blockade of a sovereign nation's ports. Johnson's statement is being watched closely by Senate Republicans, including Collins, Tillis, and Murkowski, who have each publicly demanded that the administration either seek congressional authorization or present a credible exit plan. The Dow Jones Industrial Average jumped nearly 800 points on Friday, and the S&P 500 closed out its best month in more than 5 years, despite a spike in oil prices and inflation data that came in above expectations. Investors appeared to find optimism in the 2% GDP growth figure and in signals that the Iran peace talks, though stalled, have not completely collapsed. The Nasdaq added more than 200 points. The rally came even as Brent crude topped $126 a barrel, a wartime high, and even as inflation measured by the PCE index came in at 3.2% annually, well above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. The Trump administration's push to nominate Kevin Warsh as Federal Reserve Chair before Jerome Powell's term expires on May 15th is accelerating after the Senate Banking Committee approved Warsh on a party-line vote Wednesday. A full Senate confirmation vote is expected as early as this week. Powell has announced he will remain on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors even after his chairmanship expires, and has said he will contest any attempt to remove him through legal challenges. The simultaneous presence of both Warsh as incoming chair and Powell as a continuing board member would represent an unprecedented situation in the history of American monetary policy, and has prompted concern from international financial institutions and central banks about the stability of the Federal Reserve's leadership during a wartime economic crisis. Now turning to Washington and the latest actions from the current administration. Here are 10 significant developments from the administration this week. President Trump signed the bipartisan DHS reconciliation bill into law this week, ending the 70-day partial government shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security and funding Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol for 3 full years through the end of his term. The bill passed the House and Senate along nearly party-line votes using the budget reconciliation process, which bypasses the 60-vote Senate filibuster threshold. Trump signed the legislation at the White House in a brief ceremony, calling it a historic victory for border security and the rule of law. The administration withdrew the nomination of Dr. Casey Means for United States Surgeon General and replaced her with Dr. Nicole Saphier, a Fox News contributor and board-certified radiologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Means had faced Senate skepticism over the lack of a valid state medical license and her unconventional background as a wellness influencer and podcaster rather than a practicing physician. Saphier is widely expected to receive a warmer reception in the Senate. The Surgeon General serves as the nation's top public health communicator and oversees the Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. The administration's war powers posture came under its sharpest scrutiny, yet as Speaker Johnson publicly declared the United States is not at war with Iran, a statement that, if legally operative, would eliminate the 60-day clock under the 1973 War Powers Resolution entirely. Defense Secretary Hegseth argued Thursday in Senate testimony that the ceasefire pauses the war powers clock. The White House has still not submitted a 30-day extension certification to Congress. Senator Murkowski announced she will introduce an AUMF measure if the White House does not present a credible war plan within 1 week, a deadline that falls around May 7th. The Bureau of Economic Analysis reported Thursday that first quarter 2026 gross domestic product, or GDP, grew at an annualized 2% rate, a significant rebound from the prior quarter's 0.5%, but below the 2.2% economists expected. The inflation component of the report was troubling. The PCE price index rose at a 3.2% annual rate, above the Federal Reserve's 2% target and the highest reading in nearly 3 years. Energy prices driven by the Iran war are expected to weigh further on consumer spending and GDP growth in the second quarter. Gas prices hit $4.30 per gallon on average Thursday, the highest since July 2022, as Brent crude oil surpassed $126 a barrel. The spike is directly tied to the disruption of global oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz caused by both the American naval blockade and Iran's retaliatory seizures of commercial vessels. Treasury Secretary Bessent had previously projected gas prices could fall to approximately $3 per gallon by summer if the Iran situation resolves, a projection that now appears increasingly optimistic given the persistence of the blockade and the absence of a peace deal. The Senate unanimously passed a ban on prediction market trading by members of Congress and their staff Thursday. Senator Warren had specifically raised the issue during Hegseth's testimony, questioning whether certain individuals had engaged in trades on prediction markets based on non-public information about Iran war developments. The ban, which passed by unanimous consent, reflects bipartisan agreement that congressional insiders must not profit from political information they receive as part of their official duties. It now moves to the House for a vote. The Trump administration's proposed SSI rule change targeting up to 400,000 disabled adults drew immediate condemnation from disability rights groups, congressional Democrats, and some Republican senators Thursday. The proposal, advanced through the administrative rulemaking process, would treat a family's SNAP food assistance benefits as countable income for SSI eligibility purposes, reducing or eliminating monthly disability payments for hundreds of thousands of people. The rule would need to go through a public comment period before taking effect, and legal challenges are expected. The administration has framed the change as necessary to prevent fraud and ensure SSI benefits flow to eligible recipients. The administration's Iran peace talks remain stalled as the ceasefire, extended indefinitely by Trump, continues without a confirmed second round of direct negotiations. Iran's currency has collapsed to 1.8 million rials per dollar. Inflation is running at 53.7% annually, and the country has lost more than 1 million jobs since the war began. The White House expressed ongoing optimism that Iran's economic collapse will force a diplomatic breakthrough, while Trump told reporters Thursday that the blockade is somewhat more effective than the bombing and predicted it will force a deal. The Kevin Warsh Federal Reserve confirmation is expected to come to a full Senate floor vote as early as next week. Powell's decision to contest any removal attempt through legal channels means the Federal Reserve could face an unprecedented dual leadership situation in which Warsh chairs the board, while Powell remains as a member of the board and mounts a legal challenge to any effort to formally oust him. International financial markets are watching closely, with some analysts warning that instability in Federal Reserve leadership during an active wartime inflationary episode carries significant systemic economic risks. International May Day marches and rallies took place in dozens of countries on Friday, with many overseas demonstrations explicitly calling for an end to the United States-Israeli war on Iran. In London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo, protesters marched under banners opposing the American naval blockade and calling for immediate negotiations. The European demonstrations come as multiple United States allies, including France, Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom, have publicly called for a negotiated resolution and declined to formally endorse the American military campaign. The international dimension of the May Day protests adds external diplomatic pressure to an administration already managing growing domestic opposition to the conflict. That's your full briefing for Saturday, May 2nd, 2026. I'm Nova Blake. Stay informed, stay ahead. We'll see you next time.